to new energy systems. What impact will it have on society and our lives? That's the theme for today. We have a very distinguished panel with us today, and I will introduce them as we go along before each presentation. But before we come to the actual theme of today's event, I'll just say a few words about the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, and specifically about SAPEA, as SAPEA is the host of this webinar. So SAPEA is an acronym, stands for Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, and it's a consortium that has currently 5 partners, Academia Europaea, all European academies, ESAC, European Academies Science Advisory Council, Eurocase, the Federation of European Engineering Academies, and FEAM or FEAM, the Federation of European Medical Academies. So SAPEA is one arm of the European Scientific Advice Mechanism. The other one is the group of chief scientific advisors, represented here today by Professor Nagacenovic. And there is in between a so-called SAM unit in Brussels that keeps coordinating the events. So we have kind of 2 different processes going on in the scientific advice mechanism. Advice is needed in the Commission, and there is a discussion going on about how to deal with this. Finalists decided to go ahead, and SAPEA is asked then to produce an evidence review report, which reviews what is known about the field and also gives potential options. And on the basis of that, the group of chief scientific advisors will produce a scientific opinion, which actually gives the direct advice to the European Commission. The important point about the scientific advice mechanism is that both the evidence review report produced by SAPEA and the scientific opinion produced by the chief scientific advisors are both in the public domain and are published at the same time. So everybody can see, in a sense, not only what the advice was, but also what it is based on. And this is a kind of very, I think, good and transparent mechanism. Now, in the case of today's topic, there has been a scientific opinion, which Professor Nagacenovic will talk about, based on an evidence review report, which again deals with this very important problem of the energy transition. Nobody, of course, who reads newspapers or follows news will be unaware of the importance of energy transition at this point in time. And the reason for that is also extremely well known, which is the threat of climate change. I have been surprised, actually, that last week's Nobel Prize in Physics got so very little mention in the news outlets, at least that I have seen here in the UK. It was sort of well hidden on page 25 or 26 of most newspapers with a very small notice. And given that there are still today quite a few climate change deniers, I must say I'm puzzled that the news industry, even those who are very favorably inclined to advancing that we must do something about the climate change, did not actually pay more attention to a Nobel Prize, half of which was given specifically for the physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and very importantly, reliably predicting global warming. So I think this very clear endorsement of the Nobel Prize, particularly of the work of Klaus Hasselmann and Syukuro Manabe, really should have been celebrated a great deal more and emphasized a great deal more. However, today's webinar is not primarily aimed at discussing the science behind climate change. We are more today focused on the behavioral changes that are needed in order for these things to happen, because energy transition is not just about technologies or innovation. our current lifestyles are also contributing to energy and climate problems. And the move away from fossil fuels will obviously have very big implication for society as a whole, but also for individuals. And indeed, in the evidence review report on energy transition, it was emphasized that one important point was that policy must stimulate behavior alongside technologies. And that's actually very much at the center of what we will be dealing with today. So that's all I have to say as introduction. If you have questions, then please use the Q&A box. Only the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. And please make your questions as concise as possible. It helps everybody if there are not these very long commentaries, and the chance of your question being picked is much higher if you make the question relatively concise and clear. And then, without any further ado, I will give the words to Professor Nebojša Nakajenović, who was closely involved in the writing of the scientific opinion that I just highlighted a moment ago. Nebojša is the deputy chair of the Group of Chief Scientific Advisors and is a professor at the Technical University in Vienna. So we're very pleased that you're with us today. And so please tell us a bit about the scientific opinion.
Yes, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about the scientific opinion, and would like to thank you for introducing the scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission. I would like to stress that the SAPEA group and the chief scientists work independently of each other, but very closely with each other and very closely with the unit in the Commission. So it has been a very productive cooperation, in particular on this energy transition report that I participated in. As you can see here in the first slide, on the right is the cover page of the SAPEA evidence review report, and on the left side is the cover page of the scientific opinion. And I would argue that both are really about putting people in the center of the energy transition. It is about behavioral, social, and also, of course, technological, economic change, but people are in the center. Can I have the first slide, please? In the first slide, I just wanted to show you who are the 7 advisors right now. That's the group. It has been recently rotated. Next slide, please. And I would like to explicitly recognize Karina Keshkitalo and Rolf Hoyer, who carried this report, scientific opinion, from the beginning. I joined the group less than a year ago, and they put quite a lot of effort in this, working also with the SAPEA group as observers. Let me just say, from my point of view, I really enjoyed the meetings of the SAPEA group, and really it was lots of fun working together. Next slide. I only have time to give you a bird's eye view of our opinion. First, we have some general recommendations. The first one is that the energy policy of Europe should be designed clearly to be aimed towards achieving climate neutrality and sustainability and leaving no one behind. So you can see it's rooted in the European Green Deal. And the issue of not leaving anybody behind is really important, as also shown in the SAPEA report. There are some 50 million people today who cannot afford to pay energy prices. And with the recent increase in energy prices, this is an important topic. We also recommend that a holistic systemic approach needs to be taken to maximize the synergies among various objectives, and at the same time avoid trade-offs and barriers across technologies, regulatory and market measures, and social and behavioral changes. So again, this people-centered, social-centered emphasis. And on the right, you see the Fit for 55 package that envisions that Europe will be carbon neutral by 2050. Hopefully that will be realized, and I think both of our reports show a way forward how they could be done, even though it is really a monumental effort. Next slide, please. We then proceed to make 3 recommendations. The first one is to develop flexible, efficient, and resilient European energy systems for delivering clean, accessible, and affordable energy services by integrating decarbonized energy sources, pervasive electrification in the system, initial use of blue hydrogen, hopefully with carbon separation, but eventually green hydrogen in all of the areas where electricity cannot provide the service. And here is our central recommendation: to recognize the roles of all actors and stakeholders in creating an inclusive and participatory environment that incentivizes and supports low carbon energy choices. So it's again about the people and how to incentivize the fundamental changes that would be required. And our third one is to support the coordinated combination of policies, measures, and instruments, including carbon pricing as a driving force to shape an effective, consistent, and just regulatory system. So next slide, please. I will focus on our central number 2 recommendation, and it has 3 components in the report. First is to incentivize energy efficiency and reduce energy use while ensuring sufficient services for all. And this is important, to provide more services with less, if you wish. The second one, and that is participatory recommendation, to support direct participation innovation among all actors and stakeholders, from the public and private sector to individuals and households at local, regional, European, but also international levels. So it has to be inclusive also beyond Europe, and hopefully Europe can catalyze the fundamental change in the whole world. And last, but perhaps most importantly, redistribute the additional revenues created by energy taxation or auctioning of the tradable permits to support low-income groups so that nobody is left behind, and also to promote sustainable energy systems and catalyze the required assessment. So I will finish there. Let me just show you the next slide. This is one of my personal favorites, and it's on my own background. It's not part of our report, but it shows how fundamentally 5 areas of human activities have changed: railways, flying machines, telecommunication, individual mobility, and manufacturing in periods of about 50 years. So by 2050, this needs to change again, and we are already 20 years into that. Next slide, please. And none of us, of course, know exactly how this will look like. Evidence review report and scientific opinion show some indications, but I hope that this will be a just system, a safe system for all, and that it will provide affordable services to everybody. So I will close my remarks here. My last slide just gives my email address in case there are some questions after this session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Nagicenovic, for this very concise introduction, which I think is extremely helpful to set the scene. So as mentioned before, the scientific opinion, which is what Naki just presented to us, is to a large extent based on an evidence review report. And the next 2 presentations will deal with the evidence review report. And the first speaker here is Professor Diana Åge-Forsarts, who is a member of the Academia Europaea and is a professor at the Central European University. So Diana was a member of the SAPEA working group. And I should also say, I forgot to mention that before, that the main partner in overseeing the evidence review report was actually Eurocase, the Federation of European Engineering Academies. Unfortunately, nobody from that partner is available today, but I should just mention that it was actually Eurocase that was in charge of this. So anyway, we are very pleased that you are with us today, Diana, and please start telling us a bit about the evidence review report.
Yes, I managed to unmute myself. Thank you very much for this honorable invitation. And yes, I would like to offer just a couple of thoughts from the report, which are relevant to today's webinar, because Naki already very eloquently highlighted the key messages, and I would in particular like to zoom in on the aspects of lifestyle and demand side, which were relevant from our report. And what we started out from is from the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, which outlined the different pathways to carbon neutrality. And I just want to highlight highlight the two different extremely different world visions, how such a carbon neutral world will look like. P1, let's decompose P1 and P4 scenarios. If we decompose P4 scenario here, what we see in gray is much emphasis or less emphasis on quick reductions in emissions. But then it means that there is a very large share of negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal in the second half of the century, almost as high as 20 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is very substantial, because the scientific literature has raised a lot of alarms about how large environmental impacts or other risks this would come with. And also here we see the very important intergenerational equity issues as well. So as a result, the other extreme type of future that looks like, which has none of the yellow in, so very little of the carbon dioxide removal, and mostly that is achieved by just land use and forestry measures. But the contrast is that that can only be achieved, and there are very few scenarios which can achieve that. That can only be achieved if we are very serious about demand reduction, and not only emission demand reduction, but also energy demand reduction. So yes, the carbon neutral future, if we want to have flexibility, if we want to minimize the risks, is very much also about the demand side. And that's very much the tenor of the report, the systems perspective, that in an energy transition, we shouldn't only look at which is our next technology to provide the next kilowatt hour or the next joule, but rather emphasizing that actually the only really sustainable kilowatt hour, or the only really sustainable next joule, is the kilowatt hour that never had to be produced, so that we supply through energy services without actually having to generate energy for. And that's also a little bit of an answer to one of the questions, which is already in the question and answer, that if we are very aggressive about energy efficiency, demand side action, and lifestyle changes, then we minimize the need for these very high level of different resources, natural resources, minerals, which are definitely required for the energy transition. So what this figure shows is that energy efficiency and demand side action has already been basically the largest energy fuel of Europe in the past couple of decades as well, since without energy efficiency, primary energy consumption would have been significantly higher in the last couple of decades already. So we just need to still accelerate that decoupling between GDP, between the growth of services, between the growth of well-being and our actual primary energy consumption. And for example, buildings are definitely among those where this can be very well highlighted, where this can be very easily done. This is, for example, the retrofit of Naki's university, the Technical University of Vienna, which is basically, I could say that this is the power plant of 21st century, or one of the power plants, one of the types of the power plants of the 20th century, of course, quote unquote, but on a net basis, yes, we can produce more energy in buildings than what they demand. However, that requires a very high-level systemic approach to building energy use and in general energy use, and a very coordinated effort at minimizing the energy demand, actual energy demand, supplying the same level of energy services, or in fact, very often higher level energy services, because this building is, through the very good ventilation systems, is actually, for example, more COVID safe than regular buildings. And this is just one of the papers that we cite, where we, in the report, which discusses the different opportunities, because buildings is one of the sector where definitely lifestyles and behavior matters most. But how much difference it really can make in Europe, I just want to highlight with this particular figure, which is also not in the report, but the underlying inequalities are definitely very highly addressed in the report and discussed in the report. There is, within Europe also, there are tremendous inequalities in emissions. And just for example, if we focus on Hungary, we see that the richest 1% has well over 20 times higher per capita emissions than the poorest half. Nevertheless, the majority of our policies are actually aimed at mostly, this poorer half very much are affected by the policies, whereas they cannot reduce their emissions that much more. So I wouldn't refer to this as a responsibility, but more as an opportunity, that in the top 10% or the top 1%, we definitely have tremendous opportunities, because they are also the ones who are usually can afford better the alternatives. So, certainly, alluding to the lifestyle or behavior changes or technology acceptance, especially for the top 10% of European consumers, as tremendous opportunities in terms of, because even if they cut their emissions just by 20%, that's more than what the poorest half could do, even with major, more important, bigger sacrifices. So yes, there is still a lot that we can achieve through lifestyle changes and through behavioral, and definitely people need to be in the center, and we cannot leave anyone behind. And I'm particularly happy that Benjamin Sovakol is here as well, because he has contributed much of the flesh on this bone, and so on this discussion he can certainly has very important further thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for this very good further introduction, particularly to the evidence review report. And we now move on to the presentation by Benjamin Sovakol, who is also a member of Academia Europaea, as a professor at Sussex University. And like Diana, Benjamin was a member of the working group that produced the SAPEA evidence review report. So I'm happy to give the floor to you, Benjamin, now.
Thank you very much, and what a delight to follow Diana. We didn't cross-check our presentations and ended up seeing some of the same things, although I don't think I'll say them as well as Diana. Picking up on that, I wanted to kind of emphasize what I saw as maybe the most significant contribution that I helped draft in the report. And it's a fairly complex one, because it picks up on this theme that was mentioned already, which is, do we change our behavior to fight climate change, or do we develop new technologies to fight climate change? And there's often a whole literature of scholars, advocates, even private sector entities that focus on one of those two. So we can start with what has actually been neglected a bit, which is behavioral change. So quite famously, about 15 years ago, Pakala and Sokolo talked about climate stabilization wedges, and they had these huge chunks of emissions reductions that would come from technology, like electric vehicles or wind farms. And one of the critiques was, where's the behavioral wedge? Where do we see the similarly large reductions we might get from eating less meat or foregoing our vacation? And I'm delighted that the report does emphasize behavioral change as a major dynamic that can cut emissions significantly. We show this 2021 data from the International Energy Agency, and you can see by 2030, so even in the near term, simple things like ride sharing or fewer passenger aviation trips, or maybe giving up air conditioning or walking more, can achieve millions of tons of CO2 reduction. And these things can also achieve reduction faster than building new power plants, because we can all stop eating meat tomorrow, where it may take us 5 years or 10 years to build a hydroelectric dam or to get the licensing done for a new nuclear power plant. Emphasizing this, one of the centers that I directed led a policy brief hosted by UKirk and CED, which fantastically found that you could actually displace the need for multiple nuclear power plants, 6 nuclear power plants here in the UK, if you just did behavioral change in terms of energy efficiency in buildings. Things like retrofits and better draft proofing and better windows. And this is also far, far, far more cost effective than building supply. So this convinced Jan and Nick and Steve and Pedro to call energy efficiency the first fuel. And this really links up well with Diana's comment as well about the real value of efficiency and how these things can accumulate into massive sources of emissions reduction and reductions in demand. That said, there is also a very strong case for technology. We have wondrously innovative technologies that can fight climate change. Combined cycle gas turbines are 5 times as efficient as they were 50 years ago. Nordhaus has done a fantastic history of lighting that shows 1,000-fold improvement in lighting efficiency from flames and kerosene lamps all the way up to LEDs. So we are certainly innovating new things: fuel cells, small modular reactors, direct air capture. And you can see that that's also built into the IEA's cases, where they talk about emissions reductions in gigatons way out there to like end of the century. And you can see that only about 26% of those are considered mature technologies. The rest of those emissions reductions have to come from new innovations that are only now at the earliest stages of development. And we also mention this in the report repeatedly, where we kind of talk about how there are a whole host of technologies we've got to continue to improve. Ethanol, fuel cells, maybe small modular reactors, maybe organic-based solar photovoltaics, maybe negative emissions technologies, maybe better improvements in material science, genetically modified crops. All of them could potentially play very big roles in climate mitigation. What's also, I think, very telling, though, about this diagram is it does also rule out some technologies, at least in the near term. If we want to cut emissions by 2030, we can use existing things like first generation ethanol or household solar panels or offshore wind. But there are others, like perhaps the next generation of solid oxide fuel cells or small modular reactors, that are still at least 10 years away. And that does mean that in the near term, those options might not be used. Same with the newest designs for high altitude based wind turbines and microwave solar energy that could be placed in outer space. Some of these options may be ruled off the table if we want decarbonization in the near term. The final thing is, given this tension between innovation and technology and changing behavior, I like this term of balanced disruption. I think the key is to recognize that there are potentials in both behavioral change and technology adoption. And also, many times these things are twinned, as in the uptake of a new technology requires a change in behavior, like adopting an EV and how you now charge it rather than fill it up at the petrol station. Or other changes in behavior necessitate the uptake of technologies. Like if you want to manage energy in the home, you may need a smart meter, or you may need a home energy display. And we explored this in this typology here that shows kind of dimensions of both technological radicality. So some innovations are incremental, some innovations are radical, and some require no changes in practices, and some require substantial changes in practices. Good example here is retrofitting, which keeps your house as it is, just makes it more efficient, versus things like automated mobility, which completely eliminate the need to drive. So it completely changes the practice of driving. You can see a very recent study from our colleagues at Cambridge University that plotted the potential for both behavioral change and technological change in the UK energy system. And I think it's really neat because most options cluster in the middle at requiring a mix of behavioral change and technical innovation at the same time. So it kind of suggests we have to keep pushing both sides of the coin as we pursue our decarbonization efforts. And my last slide fits in with what Diana was saying as well. That's clearly the case for the major value of energy efficiency over the past 50 years. It's a shame the IEA hasn't updated this, but they published their energy efficiency report in 2013. And you can see here the avoided energy use that we've achieved in global north countries, including the US and the UK, is far, far greater in terms of exajoules than any single source of supply. And you can see on the right graph how high energy would be, and then emissions would be, if we had never implemented these efficiency changes. We'd be consuming 65% more energy and probably paying twice as much for it. These energy efficiency improvements were coupled innovation and behavioral change. It was things like getting people to adopt new light bulbs, but also turning off the lights, getting them to maybe drive less, but also buying more fuel efficient cars. And so I think the history of this huge success of energy efficiency only underscores the necessity if it's not only technology or only behavior, but both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for this interesting contribution. And if you can stop sharing your screen, yeah, then we are back to the panel. So yeah, thanks very much. And we now move on to our fourth presenter, which is Professor Pigeon from Cardiff University. And I'm not quite sure what Nick will talk about, but we will see in a moment. The floor is yours, Nick.
Thank you, Ole, and thank you to the academies for the invitation to talk today. And I'll just welcome both reports, actually. I mean, go away and read them in the run-up to COP26, and with the looming energy crisis as well. I think they're doubly important reading. Some of what I'll say will repeat a little bit of what's been said before, but it is really important to recognize, I think, the problem we've got is socio-technical. It's both socio-technical, both society and technology, and it's systemic as well. So people, communities, organizations are all deeply implicated in both energy production and use and the interaction between the two. So I think it's really important that bringing society along on the transition journey is going to be critical. The good news there is that there's a sense in which there already is a basis for a social contract for change around the energy system. Our own research in Cardiff has shown over a number of years that people do want a greener and a more sustainable energy future. They want to play their part, but they also want to see government, corporations, other organizations contributing in the way that they can. And it's as long as that happens in a way that's consistent with a number of values that people hold. So they want a fair transition, they want some freedom and choice involved in this, not wasting finite resources in society, and what I would call a really optimistic, positive transition to a better energy system as to compare with the current one. So people are not anti-technology, they want the best technology put on this as possible. The SAPEA evidence report talks a lot about siting renewable energy facilities. I won't say much about this. We know quite a lot about the conditions on both dispute and acceptance around that, inclusion, early engagement, fairness, and I think we get better decisions if we include people. So the major infrastructure decisions that are required across Europe in the coming decades are going to have to include people, and that's clearly partly the basis for one of the conclusions that's been arrived at in the policy advice. I'll talk about demand as well, and just to reiterate what everybody has said already, it's understudied. The role of society in energy demand is particularly important across multiple areas of life: diet, heating, mobility, consumption. Our demand for energy will have to change because it impacts supply, as has been said. Less demand means much less generation, much less storage, much less backup, and potentially less reliable on unproven greenhouse gas removal technologies, and less cost to citizens as well. I mean, it's not all a rosy picture, but I mean, if you can bring demand down, you reduce stress on all those other areas of change that have to happen. How far could it go? An interesting analysis by the CREDS consortium this week, or last week, showed that a very low demand scenario would take about 50% from thinking about the UK as a system, but one could think about Europe more generally, it could be reduced by 50% by a very, very aggressive demand reduction program across all the board. And the staggering figure is as compared to 5% under current UK commitments. So that is the gap we have to bridge. It's a significant and large one. The estimate that households could contribute to this is much less easy to estimate, but the figures I've seen would suggest it may be up to 20% of that, 20 to 25% of that demand reduction would be directly a result of citizens' choices and behaviours. However, and to finish, I'd like to stress it's not just a case of us giving glossy communications aimed at behaviour change. We know from all the literature on behaviour change over many, many years in health and other domains that it's more complicated than that. Partly because energy is implicated in all the things that we take for granted that lead to a worthwhile life, our connections with friends, with family, with work, etc. So it's actually quite hard psychosocially to contemplate major transformation in that. If the pandemic has taught us anything, which we knew from the literature, that behaviour change requires good communications, it will probably require regulation, it will require infrastructure change and investment, and it will require finance, either in terms of penalties or incentives to change, closely tied to the context of change and issues. So diet is different from mobility, is different from heat, is different from consumption. So there'll be no quick or simple overnight fix. We all have to work very hard on this problem, but I welcome the report because it's a first start in laying out that agenda across Europe as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for those remarks. Very valuable indeed. And we now come to the last panel presentation, which is by Professor Øystein Jansen from the University of Bergen. Øystein is a member of Academia Europaea and is a member of the European Research Council's Scientific Council. So we welcome you, Øystein, and look forward to what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ole, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. As somebody who has warned about the problems and dangers of climate change for some decades through working in IPCC Working Group 1, it's clear that the main reason that not enough has happened is because of societal aspects, not because the science hasn't been clear enough. But still, I think there is an increasing sense of urgency that may help moving this in the right direction. And the other speakers have pointed out to some of the aspects of this, but just recall a few recent events. The Working Group 1 report of the 6th IPCC report was issued early August and says that the recent changes are widespread, rapid, and intensifying and unprecedented. This is an even stronger language than before. And it says it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, and particularly focusing on extreme events, heat waves, heavy rainfall, droughts, that are more frequent and severe. And this is language that hasn't been used before. And this brings the climate aspects and the climate crisis much closer to where people live and what people experience. And this summer there were floods in Germany, in Belgium. There's a drought in the Western US, forest fires and bushfires, many places. And the report says that evidence of absurd changes in extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones, and in particular their attribution to human influence, has strengthened. So I think there is even now an easier way to communicate the urgency of the matter, because this now affects lives of people in the primary emitting countries much more directly than before. And the report stresses the urgency in terms of turning emissions down. If we are to reach the 1.5 degree target as indicated in the Paris Accord, we only have a very limited amount of carbon to emit before we will pass the 1.5 degree or even 1.7 or 2 degrees, which are also discussed on the policy level. Carbon Tracker has estimated, based on this report, and a 66% chance of success, that to reach the 1.5 degree target, we only have 360 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 left to emit. And we are emitting a bit more than 40 gigatons per year. So this gives us 9 years left. For the 1.7 degree outcome, 16 years left before we have emitted enough to surpass the political targets. And even if there are uncertainties here, and from the 5th to the 6th assessment report, the available carbon budget has gone up to some extent. We can at least say that this needs to be handled within a few decades. Therefore, I think the urgency is also in terms of not only making political decisions, but that the decisions in the COP26 conference in Glasgow really puts us on a target where CO2 emissions go down, not only in Europe, but globally, of course. So the challenges that I see is that the sense of urgency among policymakers and public has risen, at least in Europe. And of course, the European Green Deal is an aspect of that. But emissions need to go down now. And I think there is a tendency of talking about net zero in 2050. And if you have a target that is too far away, then it will be at least a possibility that one will accept changes too late, and changes will come too late, so that it's unachievable to reach the Paris targets. And I also I think there's an important discussion to take. Will the recommendations in the SAPEA SAM report that we're discussing today really be taken up by the European Union and the governments? I think there are lots of very, very good advice there, but will it, and that is in contrast to what has been said before, and that will this really lead to a change of policies that brings the emissions down at the speed that is needed and that is urgent. And of course, as many others now have pointed out, that just and socially acceptable policies are critical for this. And seeing the various responses to the current energy price hikes in many countries in Europe, including my own, we will need to see how that plays out, because this is something that I believe probably will happen if we transform our energy system more to renewables. Prices will be more intermittent and variable. And if the system and the policies, they need to be robust against these unstable prices in order to get the public to agree on the measures we need to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Øystein, for these really very important remarks. It's clear that in the panel, it seems to me that there are some a number of optimists, and I think Øystein has perhaps been more on the pessimistic side, but maybe rather realistic in terms of worrying about what the future brings. Lots of questions have come in, and we will try to answer at least as many as possible. I mean, one thing that struck me as rather interesting was the point made by Diana, and that is coming up in one of the questions from the audience. I should say, actually, we have a very good audience. We have about 130 people with us today who actually have been with us all the time. So I think that's very good. So this is about carbon inequality. You pointed out that for the poorer part of the population, there is not that much they can do because they're already consuming very little. So we should work on the more wealthy ones. But there the question is, how do we motivate these more wealthy people for whom, let's say, financial restrictions clearly are not that very important? And so I would like to hear a bit about that point, because they seem in some respects to be the more difficult ones to motivate because they can afford to pay extra prices for energy. So Diana, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much.
You are still muted.
Okay, I think we were crossing muting. I have unmuted you myself, but
no, it's fine. No, it's fine.
Okay, it says still I was muted. Okay, so anyway, thank you. I think it's a really very important question, but I do think that's an area where we definitely need more research and more collaboration between the different disciplines, because that's not an area easy to provide science advice just by one particular discipline. Certainly, there are already different policy measures available that we can further utilize. For example, progressive taxing, if carbon tax would also, or different carbon pricing mechanisms, if we redistribute the revenues from the carbon pricing, that's certainly, and this is in our report, that does have to be in harmony with and leaving no one behind. So redistributing these to the poor, and certainly higher those who use more energy, then they will pay a higher burden of this carbon tax or other mechanisms. So carbon price, they will pay more through carbon pricing. So these, but I think we could definitely have more, and we can be more creative about these. Actually, what we do see, for example, when we talk about behavior, and Benjamin, for example, already mentioned diets, for example, I do see this, that those who are more affluent are able to, and perhaps they are more ready to switch to plant-based diets, or more emphasis on plant-based diets, perhaps because they have more access to these slightly higher priced alternatives. So that's already happening a little bit on its own. But I think we can certainly introduce further measures, incentives, nudges, but potential regulations I could envision, but it's certainly only my perspective, not from the report, that, for example, beyond a certain size of property, we could mandate that the property or the building should become zero carbon earlier than normal. So basically not nearly zero energy building, but net zero energy building. So truly zero energy building. I think this could come earlier. And I think there could be many other mechanisms that we have already tested and tried in other areas, but that could be introduced particularly in this context.
Okay, thank you. There is a question of somebody who feels that we haven't really quite mentioned this, and this is the emerging economies. And the person who raises these questions says that the fact is that because there are many emerging economies that actually need to expand and increase their energy usage, it means that those more mature economies actually have to reduce even more than perhaps they think at the moment. So what do we think about this, let's say, more international dimension? I don't know who would particularly want to address that. Would Naki say something, please?
Thank you. I mean, this is really a fundamental question, because what we are talking about is our global challenge, is not just European, but let's hope that Europe will be the leading continent in achieving sustainability. My response is that I think all of us, including Europe, have the responsibility to help developing parts of the world and emerging economies leapfrog to the new systems that we talked about today. Efficiency in the buildings, efficiency in the transport, in telecommunication, in digitalization, and the new lifestyles. And I think that's related to the question to which Diana responded, namely, if we can curb our energy demand to sufficient levels rather than exorbitant levels, because sufficiency is as important, I think, as the minimum for everybody. And we have not highlighted very much the benefits of sufficiency in terms of health, for example, and many other dimensions, not just climate. So my point is that I think Europe has a responsibility and toward Africa and other developing parts of the world to try to provide investments, try to provide required governance in order to avoid overconsumption, provide the minimum for decent lives, and at the same time, on the technological side, promote leapfrogging. And let me just conclude by saying there is hope that that's possible. If you think of the mobile phone, that's 100 times more efficient than devices it replaces, and has diffused in the developing countries as quickly as in the developed North in 30 years. So I think if we provide clear guidance on the table on the way forward, I think we can also help the rest of the world and nudge them in a sustainable direction.
Thank you. Another question relates to the possible shortage of special raw materials. The questioner points out that, for example, the future, there are certain types of products. For example, copper is just one example that we may need more of, actually, than ever before. So there will be scarcity of certain key resources. And this could obviously be a significant political problem and in a way impact on many of the prospects that we have. So what does the panel think about this problem and how to mitigate it? Naki, first.
I'll be very brief, because both evidence report and the scientific opinion discussed that in quite a detail. It's a huge challenge, not just copper, also rare earth materials, but we shouldn't forget that we would avoid the import of fossil energy and many other things through efficiency. But it is a trade-off of some sort where we really have to look for synergies. My last comment on that would be circular economy is the way forward. Urban mining and reuse of materials rather than exploitation of the earth systems to extract new materials. So I think that's the way forward, and we allude to that in both of the reports.
At the sort of danger of perhaps straying a little bit into the political, but I can't entirely help putting this question to the panel. If climate change, as particularly Einstein has pointed out, is really perhaps the most serious issue facing humanity at this point in time, it is pretty obvious that whatever we do in Europe will only have a rather limited effect. And if we, for example, do not get China fully on board, much of what we do will probably, in a sense, be futile. In view of this, one wonders whether much of the political mood music at the moment in terms of China bashing and so on is helpful. There seems to be a kind of disconnect between, on the one hand, putting an enormous amount of emphasis on criticizing China, but at the same time actually relying very much on China to come in. So yes, I'm straying a bit into the political, but it seems to be a little bit of a kind of dark elephant in the room that somehow is never talked about. Einstein.
Yes, it's an argument you often hear. For instance, in my country, Norway, which has 5 million inhabitants, of course, our emissions do not count. Our exports of oil and gas, of course, counts when they are consumed elsewhere. But you can always take China and you can group China into 5 million inhabitant units, and you will see that the Chinese are emitting much more than a Norwegian does. So the argument is you cannot avoid taking responsibility also for the emissions that we have already emitted, which are primarily Europe and North America. But so I think the aspect here is to make sure that everybody is on board on the problem. And if Europe cannot show that we have a low emission continent, who else can? So you can always find the Chinese saying, well, if you don't do it, then nobody else can. So we have to also go forward as a good example.
Okay, I think Nick also wanted to come in here.
Well, I was going to say, yes, I've been doing focus groups with members of the public on beliefs about climate change for a number of years, and I think that was the first discourse I heard 20 years ago was, well, China and others are polluting. Why should the UK take a lead? And of course, the answer is, firstly, we can be a demonstrator, or Europe as a whole can be a demonstrator and show the way with new technologies and new ways of doing things. And also, I think we have to take responsibility for our own emissions, both the ones that are produced here. And I hate to say it, if you use a different accounting mechanism called consumption-based emissions, what you find is many of the emissions that we've supposedly saved in Europe have, over the last 20 years, as we've partly deindustrialized, have been outsourced to China. And then they come back in products which we then use. So we also have some responsibility for some of those emissions that are occurring in China. Other things have to happen in other parts of the world as well, for sure. But let's take responsibility first for our own emissions in totality and show the way for other countries.
Yeah. No, I understand all that argument, but but both what you said and I stand is a little bit tangential to the question, I have to say, because the question was really whether our tactics are right. I mean, if we want China to get on board, then the question is, do we do that by political China bashing, or do we rather do it by trying to collaborate in a kind of more positive way?
Well, I'll try. Can I try to answer that? I'm not a political scientist, but certainly, again, in the UK, an advance was made 20 years ago when basically a cross-party consensus was brought together, and it has avoided a lot of the arguments that have occurred in other parts of the world. I particularly think about the United States around climate change. So my personal view is the world as a whole, or the nations and the states, have to have a similar agreement about the need to go forward together here. And that would involve engagement. I think throwing people out, everything we know from social psychology says if you create an outgroup, both you get unhappy about the outgroup and the outgroup gets unhappy about you. So I think it was doomed to failure if we don't engage.
Diana?
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with the last point. And I think what's important to see is that, first of all, the historical responsibility. So that's why we have to. But why we should is, and how we should, I think it's understanding that a lot of it is not, this is not a burden, but this is an opportunity. And I think China actually sees that. So in a lot of areas where it's clearly new business opportunity, it's clear that there is going to be tremendous business and tremendous economic opportunities of development in certain industries and certain economic areas. And China is investing there. Europe is sometimes lagging behind, or some of us is lagging behind because we're still nagging about, oh, why we, why not them? And while we are finger pointing, those who are more advanced are taking the opportunities, riding the opportunities, and will be the first ones in certain markets. In one way, they are already first in certain markets. So that's one. But the other thing, I think why, and I would agree totally with Nick and some of those before me, is if we do this, actually draws very much other markets with it. For example, if we mandate only high energy efficiency computers, high energy efficiency light bulbs, high energy efficiency automobiles, most of our markets are supplied by other economies. And if they want to comply and supply our markets, they have to abide certain technological standards. And most typically, what we see in history, it's not worthwhile for them to manufacture on two different manufacturing lines. So what they manufacture for the whole world will meet the same energy efficiency standards as what we have here. So I think that's also why I go for this. But since this panel was supposed to be more about behavioral change and lifestyle change, I think it's also happening in China, but also happening here. And again, it's about opportunity. If we ride more our bikes, if we do more active transport rather than just driving and being stuck in the traffic, not only will we get healthier, but our cities will be more livable. So there are so many other reasons why we should engage in these alternatives and we should ride these opportunities. And COVID has advanced so many of these transitions, these transformations, that I think we can get better off than other regions. That's why and how we should do it.
Okay, thank you. I think I would like to have a few more questions in because we are beginning to run out of time. So somebody sort of mentioned the point that behavior change needs to be generalized and in bracket possibly forced, and raises the questions about freedom, etc., etc. So the question is, again, coming back to a bit of a point that Einstein made, the changes are sort of in the right direction, but they're probably not fast enough. And so the question is, will there be a need, as it were, to generalized behavior in the sense that certain things will have to be dictated, that this is the way things have to be done? And how do we view this in relation to risk of the sort of freedoms that we generally cherish?
So I can give a very simple answer here, and the answer is yes. So we did a very extensive 3-year project called HOPE, Household Preferences on Energy. We looked at 4 high-income, high-emitting European countries, Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway. And we did 3 years of work with households, telling them their carbon footprints, tracking their carbon emissions, and talking about what they can do to cut their consumption. And the kind of core finding is across all 4 countries, you could achieve about half of a household's emissions reductions voluntarily. So these are things that if you get them information and knowledge, they'll do it. They'll take one less trip, they'll walk a bit more, they'll eat a bit less, they'll share their car. But for the other half, the really hard stuff, giving up meat, making sure you don't take any air trips at all, nope. So it really suggests that for half of decarbonization, we can get there. But for the other half, we need punitive measures that will force, coerce, or incentivize homes to get all the way there.
So that's a tough one, but thank you. That's very important information, actually. Does anyone on the panel have any comments on that? It seems to me to be quite a critical point. Diana?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important that we achieve as much as we can, as Benjamin also mentioned, through nudges, information, although behavioral science actually shows that there is limited effect of just providing information, but information combined by nudges, incentives. And at the end, as Benjamin said, perhaps punitive, but before that, just standards. But I think when we talk about just freedom and our and entrepreneurship and constraining anything, I think what we really need to understand that climate change is already putting more limiting more our freedom, and it's going to affect our freedom and entrepreneurship significantly more than what we may have to do as a result of or in the process of mitigation. And we have the choice of which type of freedoms perhaps to interfere with and how to perhaps correct for those. While if we just suffer those from climate change, we will have no choice.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. My answer is that it sounds a bit trite, but we just have to work really hard at the hard things. We've just spent 18 months working hard at keeping people at home, and governments have found that is not easy. They've had to put into place all sorts of measures, both support for isolation, communication. They've had to produce a vaccine in a record time, et cetera, et cetera. So think about this problem as equivalent to that, you know, how do we reduce an issue like overuse of international aviation? Not easy, but we've seen lots of examples of behavior change in the past. The example I always think of is seat restrainers, seat belts in cars, where initially people were very resistant to that idea. It required regulation, it required communications, a clear statement for manufacturers to put seat belts in all cars. And then, of course, when the change came, admitted, you know, it was a restriction on freedom, but it's one that in the longer term people accepted because they saw the sensibleness of actually protecting people from major accidents. So, but coming back to it, engaging the European public and the publics worldwide, actually, it's not just a European question, about which measures to use and what are the boundaries of change is a really critical job at this point in time. So let's find out what's really hard and what we really need to work hard. We know some of it because Ben's nodding. We know the literature and where it really is hard, but can we get solutions to help citizens to help co-create solutions with us? That's the other hope.
Well, that obviously also raises another question that has come up, is about education, actually. Are we doing enough at the more basic level, let's say school level, perhaps even at the university level, in actually educating people about these problems?
Very quick comment here, which I think you'll find humorous. We ran a series of studies with children in schools a few years ago about their knowledge of low carbon mobility. And while it's certainly that some children had kind of fantastic expectations like flying rocket cars, the children knew more about electric cars than the adults. They had better predictions of range, battery performance, and cost, as well as brands like Tesla than most adults did, because we actually ran a survey. So it is kind of interesting that we presume that our youth don't know about these things. And in some places, they may know even more about these high-tech trends than a lot of us, which I guess bodes well to educational curricula in the schools as they are.
Okay, Naki also wanted to say something.
Yeah, well, our future is in the hand of the youth, so I fully agree. That's the way forward, and I think Fridays for Future is a good example. I just wanted to add to the discussion the fact that this is not getting any easier, and science has a huge role to play together with engineering and medical communities, because there is also, with the digitalization, there's misinformation. There are alternative facts that compete with evidence-based facts that we all work on. So I think very careful social steering needs to be implemented. I think too much dictatorial measures can produce a counter effect. So I think we talked today about the inclusiveness of social change. The emphasis needs to be there. And I think education from elementary school to universities has a huge role to play. Maybe I just add one more aspect to it. Part of our problem in the academia is that we are working in silos. We are lacking the integrated platform to inform the public holistically rather than to argue on the details, which is, I think, our scientific training, to argue on details. But I think a holistic integrative perspective is called for to convince people on the sustainable way forward.
Einstein wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think it's important. What we are talking about now is how to avoid leaving too much burden on the upcoming and next generations. So it's clear we have a mandate from the young people in terms of leaving the planet in a better way than for them to take over. that said, I think there is a large change in higher education now to create more cross-disciplinary sustainability curricula, but it goes slowly, and there are lots of hindrances in our universities to make that happen across the silos. But there is, at least as far as I see, a very a concerted effort now to change things in our universities and higher education, and that includes also how we train our teachers.
Okay, thank you. As a last question, I think since we have tried to focus quite a bit in this discussion on behavior changes, and there has been generally quite a bit of optimism, I sense, from the panel about this. But I just wonder whether we have entirely considered what do you think are the barriers to behavior change? We have maybe not quite emphasized that enough in this discussion. I would like to hear from, in a sense, everyone on the panel. What do you see are the barriers to behavioral change? Because if you can identify those, maybe then we can do an even better job on the behavior changes. And then I think we unfortunately are out of time. So we can sort of go around the panel perhaps, and let me start with Benjamin.
I'll be very brief because I'm sure Nick and Diana and others have lots to say. I quite like some of Nick's work on life course stages, and that kind of implies behavioral change sometimes happens for things out of your control, like an illness, an accident, or having children, or your children going off and leaving the home. And it's those kind of life course changes that means our identity could be totally different 10 years from now than what it is now. And that makes behavioral changes that we do now maybe be reversible 10 years from now.
Nick?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I mean, I think some of the issues we have to deal with. Firstly, there are infrastructure issues. So in many areas, the infrastructure is just not there to give us the opportunity to change. Those all have to be worked on. There's this terrible question of rebound, which the economists talk a lot about, that if you save money or save resources in one area, then you're going to spend them somewhere else. I don't have a simple solution to that. I think the biographical work we've done makes me a bit of a pessimist. I hate to say it, Ben, but you can smile because what it means to be human is to be a social being, and we are connected in multiple ways with people, not just digitally. That's the question. And so it's true, disruptions in life course, whether going to university or moving your house or some other big change, is a moment for actually altering some of those connections and altering what we do. But equally, they're very sticky as well. So I'll give you a good example. I have a relative who lives in Australia, so I'm always in, and I don't go very often at all for environmental reasons, but I'm always in a dilemma about keeping in connection with that person, and given that we have international transport. And then the final thing I'll just put in, which makes me a little pessimistic, is the risk of moving too quickly. Or moving with the wrong thing. Many years ago, there was a point made that in technology development and in lifestyle change, you could say it's the same thing. But at the moment that we can make a choice and try to steer the system, there's too much uncertainty around. And by the time the uncertainty clarifies, it's too late, and we're locked into systems where there might be unintended consequences. So I think that is one of the biggest issues for me, is that how do we shape societies, shape's the wrong word, actually take society along in a way that minimizes risk as well for spending money on the wrong systems or the wrong decarbonisation options or the wrong changes. And I think we forget about the risk sometimes, and the risk holds back politicians inappropriately, but we know we can deal with risk if we think about it in a systematic way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Eystein?
Yeah, and I'll be very brief. I think at least people are understanding that things needs to be done, and they are also willing to do so. But if the regulations and policies that are imposed are seen as unfair, then it won't fly. So I think that's the most important thing, that the regulations and policies, incentives are seen as fair to those who have less. If we can do that, I think it'll be much easier.
Okay, thank you. Diana?
Yes, thank you. I fully agree with those who spoke before, especially with Nick, that infrastructures are tremendously important. And I did want to mention that earlier, but I just forgot that if we have if a city, the majority of a city is not, the public space in the city, presently most of that is currently owned by the automobiles. And if we reallocate that more to active transport and people and parks, and we make it more difficult, the infrastructure more difficult for all cars, but more accessible for active modes, initially it will be politically very unpopular. On the other hand, that will definitely allow and certainly incentivize a lot more active transport and so on. But I think the trick is, and I fully agree with Nick, that we should avoid perhaps putting in too much money or forcing something that perhaps won't work or is the wrong thing. On the other hand, I think there is absolutely no wrong thing, and we cannot go wrong by simply redefining the focus of our economies from consumption to more well-being. So currently our economy is about providing more and more consumption, and that's what drives the economy. But I think if we can refocus that more and more, providing more and more well-being, more health, more education, more services, more entertainment, more leisure, which is not resource intensive, then even the rebound won't matter, because then we just allow people to live better. So I think, and that's definitely some behavior change or lifestyle change, that we focus, instead of buying the third mobile phone per year, instead of that we focus more on our family and have more free time to enjoy nature and more to be with our family. And finally, my final point is about that I think what we need to go on in terms of science, that I think our main mistake is that we mostly assume, or we did a lot for technological change and providing economic incentives, but both of these assume that people make most of their decisions on rationality. But in fact, a lot of people's decisions are not based on rationality; it's based on feelings. So I think we really need to, I think we really need to work closer, for example, with arts, because arts understands much more about people's feelings, and perhaps we can have more fruitful outcomes if we do work more about our feelings and not only humans as rationals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the last words to Professor Nakicenovic.
Difficult to have last word after all of this. I agree with all of that. I think it is really about habits, about inertia, about the feelings, as others have said. So my perspective would be that our biggest challenge in achieving the societal and fundamental behavioral changes is the time. We only have 30 years left. In my slides, I try to illustrate that it's possible, but we don't know in which direction it will go. So social steering is essential. In my view, we cannot get around changing the very fabric of our cultures, the norms, in the direction of sustainability. And I think it's a collective effort. I hope it's going to be inclusive, but as other colleagues have said, it will require also regulatory mechanisms and very, very strong steering in the right direction.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And unfortunately, we have run out of time in spite of having actually gone 20 minutes over time. But I'm happy to say that we still have the at least a major part of the audience with us, which is actually unusual. So that shows, I think, that this has been a very interesting discussion and which has been appreciated by all those listening in. I apologize to the many people who put in questions that we haven't had time to deal with, but they will be retained, and there may be an opportunity to reply to these questions outside the format of this webinar. So thank you very much, particularly to the panel. You've been very interactive, and I think it's been a very valuable discussion. Thank you to the SAPEA organizers, particularly to Toby, for masterminding this, and also to the Academia Europaea Cardiff Hub and the Bergen Hub, who have been involved in this organization. I think it's been a pleasure to chair this session, and I once more thank all of you for being so helpful and interactive.